Welcome to this evening with Roy Baumeister, part of the Science, Technology, and Society Lecture Series at Elmhurst College. This lecture has been selected to be recorded for Chicago Amplified, a WBEZ web-based audio program that captures some of the most exciting and informative cultural programming in the Chicago area. On your printed program, you'll find out how you can hear this lecture again or share it with others through Chicago Amplified. A video of tonight's lecture also will be available. Please refer to your program for the web address. At this time, I'd like to ask that you please make sure your cell phones are turned off. And now I'd like to introduce the chair of the Elmhurst College Department of Psychology, Dr. Patrick Ackles. Thank you very much.
Faculty, students, and members of the Elmhurst community, I welcome you to tonight's Science, Technology, and Society lecture. I am delighted and very pleased to introduce you to tonight's speaker, the distinguished experimental social psychologist, Dr. Roy Baumeister. His talk will be on his 2011 book, Willpower, Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength. This book was a New York Times bestseller, which is a rare thing for a psychologist. And it was also designated as one of the best books of the year in 2011 by Amazon. Professor Baumeister is the Francis Eminent Professor in Psychology in the Department of Psychology at Florida State University. He's also the Director of the Social Psychology Area Program there. He received his AB degree from Princeton University, and I won't say what year. He has MA degree from Duke University, and then back to Princeton for his PhD. He is a renowned researcher and scholar with at least, it's hard to count, 499 publications, along with 30 books. When I read that, I was trying to think, have I read 499 publications? So right? Holy cow. His research and theoretical interests include, but are not limited to, the self, self-control, free will, consciousness, social rejection, irrationality, and self-defeating behaviors, motivation, aggression, and sexuality, plus other things. He's received numerous competitive research grants over the years to support his research. These grants come from the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Institute of Health, the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, and the Templeton Foundation. And I'll conclude by mentioning that he's received numerous awards for his outstanding and prolific work. I'll only mention two. In 2011, it was given the Jack Block Award for distinguished contributions to personality psychology from the Society of Personality and Social Psychology. In 2013, he'll be receiving the William James Award, which is a Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to the basic psychological science of psychology, and this is from the Association for Psychological Science. It's an incredible achievement. He's also received a lot more, but let's hear from Dr. Baumeister.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, and I'm delighted to be here tonight, and especially appreciate the chance to talk about self-control and willpower. As you mentioned, the subtitle of our book is Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength. Well, I feel some need to justify that. People say all sorts of flamboyant things to sell books, I guess. But given my scientific training, you have to justify your assertions. Can we indeed make a case that this is the greatest human strength or something close to it? Well, I think you can. I think the evidence continues to come out all the time showing the benefits of self-control. People who are good at this, who have good self-control, they're more successful in school, they're more successful in their work afterwards, they earn more money, and that's achievement, but also in the social sphere they do better, they have more friends, they are rated more highly by other people, they They have better, more stable relationships to others, romantic and otherwise. They are happier. You might think, oh, self-control, it means denying yourself. It's probably good for you, but it's going to be a grim, ugly business. But no, happier on both the measures of overall life satisfaction and day-to-day feeling good, more positive than negative emotions. The amount of stress you have is lower. The amount of guilt you suffer is lower. Measures of psychological adjustment, how are you doing in life? People with good self-control do better at that. Both mental and physical health are better. Some of the obvious things like less addictions and sort of problem behaviors, but we're learning more and more that many physical health problems have roots in behavior, and that people with good self-control can resist these by not smoking, by taking their medicine, following up with their appointments, and just taking care of themselves in general better. They behave better in all sorts of ways, fewer crimes, less violence. People with good self-control, there's just one that was tracked people over several decades are less likely to be arrested. And spouse abuse, nice laboratory studies, they're less likely to do nasty things to the people they love and live with. They restrain from prejudice and discrimination better than others. And at the far end of life, they live longer. The question of whether psychological traits contribute to longevity, that's fascinated the field for a long time. There's a lot of discussion of intelligence, and I guess there was some effect that smart people live a little bit longer than dumb people, perhaps for obvious reasons. It's not a huge effect. I wish it were larger. But in terms of other personality traits, people tried a variety of things. But once they discovered self-control and conscientiousness, which is sort of the umbrella, research on other things kind of paled in comparison. It's one of the most important traits for extending life. And again, you can understand why. You take care of yourself better. You don't smoke and get addicted to drugs and develop other bad habits. So all these things contribute to living longer. That last point, it's difficult to identify any major set of personal problems or social problems that don't have some degree of self-control failure in them. That, to me, is a rather striking sentence, but it shows how pervasive this is, and goes to the question of can this be considered the greatest human strength? Let me just contrast it for a moment with self-esteem. I started my career studying self-esteem, and we had high hopes for self-esteem too, that by raising people's self-esteem and making themselves love each other, or love themselves more, love each other is another, but making them love themselves more, that they would produce all sorts of beneficial effects there too. But self-esteem kind of turned into a flop, and we followed it and tracked it for a long time. Looking back, it was an honest mistake. There were studies showing, for example, there were correlations that children with higher self-esteem were getting better grades in school. In America in particular, we're always searching for ways to help kids do better in school without actually having to do more homework. So it was very appealing. I think, why don't we just tell them they're great at math and tell them to love their own math ability and they'll be better in math. Unfortunately, it didn't work. The correlation was real, but self-esteem was a result, not a cause. When they stopped looking at just do these things go together and track people over time, well, doing well in school in 10th grade led to higher self-esteem in 12th grade, but it didn't work in reverse. Having higher self-esteem in 10th grade did not make you do better in school in 12th grade. So self-esteem, despite the early promise, as I said, it was an honest mistake, was an effect and not a cause. But with self-control, it really is a cause. These findings come from these longitudinal studies that track people over time. Some of the most dramatic ones, you may have heard about the marshmallow test that Walter Mischel did with, you give kids a marshmallow or a cookie or whatever the kid's favorite treat was, and say, you can eat this right away, but if you can wait 15 minutes, then I'll give you 2 of them. You can wait until I get back. And so some kids could and some kids couldn't. And then when he tracked those people down 15 years later, 20 years later, and so on, now they were measured when they were 4, in other words. So we measured them when they were grown up, and now they're measured when they're about 40. Still, it shows up differences. It's almost impossible to measure anything when somebody's 4 and have it predict anything about adult life. Very dramatic evidence that these things last a long time. And these studies where they track people in New Zealand, there's this giant study they've been doing, tracking people over long periods of time. Again, their self-control measured at 10 or 12 years old predicted outcomes well into adulthood, like whether they were arrested and how much money they make, things like that. So false promise of self-esteem was a big disappointment to many of us. But self-control seems to be a much more potent way to contribute to human success. and happiness. All right, what do we mean by self-control? I think of it essentially the ability to change, to alter your behavior. Psychologists often use the term self-regulation rather than self-control. Self-regulation. And self-regulation is I like the term regulate because to regulate means to change, but not just any change. It means change based on an idea. When the government regulates how people make buildings or make sausages or whatever, it doesn't just say do it differently. It says we have standards, we have rules, that the building has to have doors and windows, and the toilets have to flush, and the heat has to work, and all that. Likewise, sausages have to contain a certain amount of meat or whatever the rules are for sausages. So it regulates, but to regulate up to some idea, some goal, some ideal, something the way it should be. Self-control is vital for human social life. In order to get along with others, we need to follow rules. And human society, much more than any other, has all sorts of rules. It has tax laws, it has moral principles, it has group norms, and so forth. So we are constantly adjusting our behavior to conform to the rules. And they only work because people follow the rules. The system only works if people will comply with it to some degree. In those societies where the rule of law breaks down and people don't follow the laws, that's usually chaos. And you think, oh, great freedom if you don't have the police enforcing the rules. No, it's a disaster. I mentioned morality already. We sometimes call self-control the moral muscle. And I'll come back to the muscle part in a minute. But really, moral behavior depends on your ability to control yourself, to override impulses to do immoral, sinful things. Morality is mostly about restraining selfish impulses so that you can do what is best for the group, that will enable the group to survive and prosper. So that capacity is self-control. And it really underlies, if you look at lists of immoral actions, like the 7 deadly sins, they're really pretty much a bunch of different kinds of self-control failure, gluttony and sloth and so forth. Likewise, lists of virtues mostly depend at some degree on self-control. Morality depends on that, and even free will. I've gotten into interesting discussions with philosophers since I've been doing this work, that free will and the ability to make choices and perform what's rational, that too implies your ability to control yourself, to resist your impulses. Unlike many other animals, we don't have to act on the first impulse we have. We can restrain it, and that at least creates a modicum of freedom, and that we can do something else other than what we immediately feel like. All right, now this brings up the question, how much do people do these things? How often do people exert self-control? Is it something that happens every day, every week, twice a year? Does it happen constantly? Many of these basic motivation questions we don't have the answer to in psychology. Indeed, the kind of work I do usually is incapable of answering them, because we set things up in the laboratory, and so it works in the laboratory, but that's a highly artificial environment. It certainly doesn't tell you how often this happens in real life. Well, last 20 years or so, people have started using this technique called experience sampling, where they try to see what goes on in real life. They have people wear a beeper. And that's what we did in the study that was just published earlier this year. We had 200 people in central Germany, where the first author was, Wilhelm Hoffman, who's actually now at the University of Chicago. But when he started this, he was in Würzburg, Germany. So he hired a couple hundred people to wear these beepers. The beeper would go off every 2 hours at some randomly determined point. And when it went off, the person was supposed to stop and say, are you having a desire now? And if so, for what? And does this desire conflict with other desires? Are you resisting the desire? Are you engaging in it? If you don't have a desire now, you can say in the last half hour, did you have a desire? By doing this, we collected 10,000 reports of what people were doing. There's 10,000 little snapshots taken from daily life. And we could see how often do people have desires and how often do they restrain them. So it gave us an initial idea of how much this sort of thing happens. Basic questions which we didn't know, and we didn't even among us, the researchers, we didn't have very strong predictions or any basis for prediction how much that would happen. Well, there's a lot of findings there, but to get to the relevant ones, we asked, if they're having a desire, do you actually engage in it? Now remember, we had always asked them, are you resisting the desire? That's where self-control comes in. Are you trying to restrain yourself from eating that donut or whatever? Now it turns out whether they resist or not makes a big difference. If they don't resist the desire, well, you think it might be 100% of the time, but sometimes there are opportunity constraints. Maybe you don't have a gun. Maybe it's raining or whatever. So we found about 70% of the time, if people don't resist the desire, they act on it. They do what they wanted to do. But if they do resist, it drops to 17%. So 53 percentage points. That's a huge half of all the desires people reported were successfully resisted. So that suggests people are using their self-control to restrain their desires. And that's not even the only thing we use self-control for, but just for that, people are doing it a lot. And I think we found people had desires about half the time that we beeped them. So people are having a lot of desires every day and successfully resisting many, but not all of them. And to extrapolate from that, how much does this happen? As I said, figure about half the responses indicated that people were currently feeling a desire, which extrapolating to 16 hours awake in a 24-hour day, that would mean people are in states of desire about 8 hours a day. That's a lot of wants that we have. But 3 or 4 hours a day, we are resisting those and restraining them. And I guess there's a one glorious or naughty half hour a day devoted to giving in to desires that you have previously resisted. So that's an average across the population, but it suggests there's a lot of this going on. And again, it is crucial to live in a civilized environment. We have to restrain our impulses. It's one reason why culture, which has worked so well for our species, isn't really, why don't other species pick it up? I mean, look how well we've survived and reproduced. Culture is tremendously successful as our biological strategy. How come other species don't bring it up? Well, they don't have the psychological equipment to make it work, including restraining their desires. And we need to obey the laws. We need to not take food off other people's plates in the restaurant, even if it looks good. All sorts of things are required in order to make our institutions work. All right. In understanding these phenomena, one point is willpower is limited. Willpower is one of the key ingredients in self-control. So we think of it as the energy that enables you to resist the desire or to make yourself do something or to control your thoughts or your performance. It seems to take some kind of energy. So the folk idea of willpower implies that there's some energy that's possibly limited. We came around only rather reluctantly to using the folk term because the popular terms have all sorts of connotations, and scientists like to make up their own so that you're not necessarily invoking all the baggage that goes with it. But in this case, it proved to be correct. And so what made us start thinking in energy terms was that some of the experiments we did suggested that yes, there is a kind of energy or some kind of inner resource that gets used up when people exert control, when they restrain their desires or restrain their impulses or something, that it takes energy and afterwards you have perhaps less of it. The original studies to test this is we would give people some task to exert their self-control, and then we would measure self-control on some seemingly unrelated task afterwards. Now there were different theories. If it was more of a mental thing or a mental state, information processing state, and these were the dominant theories when we started, then doing the first act of self-control should sort of get your self-control program up and running, and so you should do better on the second task, and that was a legitimate prediction. And then we had the prediction from the child psychologists who talk about self-control as a skill. Children acquire skills. Well, skill stays the same from one trial to the next. It just gets better slowly over the long run. But the pattern that willpower or energy applies is that the first task would use up some of it, so you would have less available on the second task. Here's one of the early experiments we did. We told people in social psychology you usually can't tell people what you're going to study exactly because that makes them all self-conscious about that and their behavior gets weird. Certainly if we brought people into the laboratory and said, we're going to test your self-control, that would have elicited all kinds of weird reactions. So we can't do that. What we usually find it necessary to do is tell them you're studying one thing and then secretly actually study something else. So we told them we were studying how people remember various tastes. And we're going to have them eat stuff and see if they could recognize the flavors stuff like that. And that gave an excuse to say, we don't eat anything for 3 hours before the experiment. It's important that you come in with your mouth in a neutral state. The point was we wanted them hungry. So anyway, the person comes to experiment, they've skipped lunch and they're hungry. And then the next part, I guess, was a little mean. We set up a microwave oven in the laboratory and baked chocolate chip cookies there, and you know how it blows out the scent there, so it really smelled awfully good. We knew it was tempting because we were getting complaints from other people who were at offices near the laboratory who were saying, I'm in my office trying to do my statistics and I'm smelling your cookies all day. That's driving me nuts. So sure enough, anyway, the participant comes for the study and it's hungry and missed lunch or whatever, and now it smells really good. Not just the smell, we have them sit at a table where there's a tray with these freshly baked cookies, and in case they were into cookies, we had chocolate candies also arranged tastefully around it. All looked very appealing. And then also on the table, there's a bowl of radishes. And by random assignment, the experimenter says to some of them, well, you've been assigned to the radish condition, so your task is going to be eat these radishes, and don't touch the cookies there for other people. So the idea is to make them use up their willpower, resisting the temptation, because since we had a control condition of people who were told to eat the chocolates and not the radishes. That was no problem, turns out. And then we had a no food control, because you always have to see is there any special effects of having food. But the ones who are interested in are the ones who had to sit there seeing those cookies and smelling those cookies and wanting those cookies, but instead had to make themselves eat those stupid old radishes. To maximize the temptation, we left them alone for 5 minutes. Of course, we didn't trust them. So we secretly observed through this little hidden observation window we had. And they were tempted. We saw, lots of longing glances over at the cookies when they were sitting by the radish. So people would pick up the cookies and sniff them and put it back. So we would drop them on the floor and put it back. But anyway, nobody bit into the forbidden food, and everybody managed to eat the better part of a radish. So they succeeded at the first self-control task. That should use up some of their willpower. So then the next part was to measure what they had left. So we took it to a different room where there's no food and it was all neutral. Ostensibly this was for a different project. And we borrowed a procedure from stress research, which is how long do people keep going on a difficult, frustrating puzzle before they give up. Because that takes self-control too. And you're not getting anywhere, you're not solving it, and you just want to quit and give up, but do you instead make yourself keep trying and persevering? And in America, we particularly admire perseverance. Of course, the puzzle, in fact, was made unsolvable because it spoils the experiment if they solve it. But we've tried to get solvable puzzles and get the same results. Anyway, sorry, somebody seems to have messed up my the slides alignment here. But the radish is 8.35 minutes, the chocolate 18.9, and the no food control 21. So what that means is the people in the radish condition, they had used up some of their willpower, resisting the temptation of the radish, resisting the temptation of the chocolate in order to make themselves eat radishes. That took something out of them, used up some energy, some willpower that they then did not have to help themselves keep going and keep trying and keep striving to solve the puzzles. So that was one sign that self-control seems to use up energy, use up some kind of limited resource. Now, lots and lots of other studies have shown that in the interim. That was a study was done in the mid-90s. In fact, two British guys last year published a meta-analysis where they combined many studies from many different laboratories, and it was clear that this effect is quite robust in the laboratory. But as I said, that doesn't necessarily mean it happens in everyday life. After we'd finished the beeper study, we thought, I wonder if we could see if there's any sign of this ego depletion. That's the term we used for when you've used up some of your willpower. I wonder if we could find any. I'm used to having a little more control over my media. Got to be in there somewhere.
It's an experiment.
Yes. Okay. Well, there are the results. So we wanted to see, was there some way we could, let me just back up for a moment, look at the data from the beeper study and see if there's any sign of ego depletion. So what Hoffman figured out is you would see if they had had previous desires that they had resisted during the day, and supposedly that would build up. So he looked at, the last time we beeped you, and the time before, and the time before that. Did you resist a desire? Did you report resisting a desire? Now, obviously, we miss a lot because we're only beeping them now and then. But still, we could see, do they have any report of having resisted other desires? And if so, how recent was that? And he did a weighted combination of the more recently and the more often you've resisted any desire the same day. Well, that makes you presumably more likely to give in when you resist again. It weakens your capacity to resist and restrain your desires. And that's what we find here. If you look at the top line, when they don't resist the desire, well, then it makes no difference whether they've resisted other desires or not. That goes at about the same rate, give in at about a 70% rate regardless of previous states. So depleting your willpower makes no difference to acting on desires that you don't resist. But when you do resist, your likelihood of the resistance failing goes up the more you've resisted other desires as the day wears on. So in a day where there are demands on you, where you're resisting desires and exerting self-control, you start to run out of gas and you become more likely to give in to whatever is the next impulse that comes along, especially if it's one that you would normally restrain and control. You're more likely to indulge it and do what you want to do rather than perhaps what you should do. So I like that because, again, it shows that not only in the laboratory where this was very well replicated, but out in everyday life, there are these patterns that people use up their energy and then self-control begins to fail. We looked at people who scored high on our trait measure of self-control. They too showed a variety of interesting effects. A first prediction was, well, self-control is for resisting your desires. So people with good self-control probably resist a lot more desires. Obvious prediction, but it was significant in the opposite direction. Many theories like that, but that's psychology. So that kind of threw us for a loop. Why are these people with good self-control able to get by with less resistance? Why aren't they using their capability more? We also find they have less guilt. We found that they were happier, and so on. And then when we start to put this together, maybe what good self-control is, instead of resisting desires, it's for avoiding problem temptations. We went back through all the desires and coded for the ones that were likely to be problems, like wanting to have sex with your coworker at work, versus a desire, like the least conflicted desire was a desire for a cup of tea. So most people don't have much trouble and need self-control. No, I can't have another cup of tea. So we coded for the desires that were likely to generate problems. And people with high self-control had fewer of those. So it suggests self-control operates not just in the heat of the moment, which is how we tend to think of it, but rather maybe they set up their lives to run in smooth and effective pathways. We call this in the book playing offense rather than defense. You're essentially, that self-control maybe operates by means of establishing good habits and getting rid of bad habits, rather than relying on it to bail you out in a crisis. Or to put this in a more pictorial way, this is often a cultural stereotype or image of self-control. It's Ulysses/Odysseus coming home from the siege of Troy and standing on the deck there, and those are the sirens. You probably remember the story of the sirens. They sang this beautiful music. The sailors would hear it and be tempted and want to hear it better, so they would steer closer to hear better, and they would steer their ship onto the rocks and crack up and sink. So there's Ulysses on the deck trying to resist this temptation. He's using some pre-commitment devices, like he's tied to the mast there. So he can't steer under the desk into the rocks. Apparently dressing up in women's clothes helps. I don't understand that part. But the guys doing the rowing, they've had their ears stopped up so they can't hear the music. Still, anyway, that's our image of the person struggling with or without pre-commitment to resist the temptation. But maybe the person with good self-control just took a different route home and avoided the problem altogether. Maybe that's the new way we need to think more about self-control, operating at a macro level to organize your life rather than wait for the moment of crisis. For example, another thing we found was that self-control is a little bit helpful with dieting and eating and so on. It was much more helpful in terms of the size of effect that it predicts on work and school performance. And work and school performance, what about self-control enables you to do better there? People's idea might be that, oh, well, it helps me at the last minute when I have to stay up all night and working. We were talking earlier, some of it about doing all-nighters. But I think people with good self-control don't do as many all-nighters. I think they get their work done ahead of the time, so they're not in a position where they need it. And yes, when you get to the point where your term paper's due tomorrow and you haven't started, well, you probably need some self-control to discipline yourself to plug away and get it done all night. But that's not the high self-control strategy. That's to start early and get it done on time so you don't get into that situation. All right. What our work has suggested is self-control operates like a muscle. That's, I think, the best analogy still, that your capacity to control your own behavior works a lot in many of the same ways that a physical muscle does. So I mentioned the one already, like a muscle gets tired after exertion. In the same way, self-control, your capacity for it seems to go down after you exert it. So use self-control for one thing, something else comes along and you don't have as much strength or energy left to deal with the second one. There are other analogies to, or other parallels to a muscle, however. One is that many of these effects are conservation effects. These so-called ego depletion effects where you've used up your self-control and you don't do as well. It doesn't mean that your tank is empty, that you've got zero willpower left. Rather, it seems that people, once they start to have expended some of their willpower, they start automatically, without realizing it, they start conserving their energy for other challenges and other projects. They save it for things that are important. And this is much like what happens with physical energy, right? The start of a tennis match, the player might run after every shot and try to hit every one. When you start to get tired, you don't play full blast until you're exhausted and then fall limp onto the court and need to be carried off. When you start to get tired, you start to conserve your energy. If it's hit really hard and you can't get it, you let it go. You don't even try. And that way you start to conserve your energy. And I think willpower is much like that, that probably you never want to get down to zero. But these effects indicate that people are conserving their remaining energy. When we give them something really important to motivate them, then suddenly they can suck it up and perform just as well as anybody else on self-control, although then they're super depleted after that. So there is something really that gets used up, but they are, it isn't used up to the point of empty. And this was of some interest to us too, doing these experiments. You know, we bring people in and deplete their self-control and then send them back out into the world. Are we really releasing people after they've been in our experiment for an hour with all their energy used up? They ultimately be at the mercy of anyone who wanted to sell them something or convince them to have weird sexual behaviors or join a religious cult or anything like that. We thought, well, this is not being very nice of us. But no, they still have plenty of willpower there. They're just saving it for important things, like when somebody tries to get you to join an organization you don't want to join. So conservation is a second parallel. And a third parallel, which also is quite, I think, interesting and important, which is that just like a muscle gets stronger when you exercise it, there are about a dozen published studies suggesting that your capacity for self-control can be improved by exercise. So yes, the immediate effect of exerting self-control is that your willpower is depleted and you don't have as much, but we don't want people to come away from this talk saying, oh, self-control uses up willpower, I'm never going to exert self-control anymore. You know, that would be a very socially undesirable message for me to be putting out here. So instead I can say, no, it's good. Exert self-control every day. Do something, make yourself better in some small way each day. And that will indeed build character, to use the old Victorian phrase. It will improve your capacity to deal with other challenges. And as I said, about a dozen published studies have had people do some kind of self-control exercise for a period of time, builds their strength and capability. And then they're brought back to the laboratory and tested on some other kind of self-control that has nothing to do with what they exercise, nothing to do, no resemblance to the exercise, and yet they do better on it. For our studies, the lab things, we use fairly abstract tasks that have no inherent meaning, mentioning things like if you're right-handed, we tell them, well, we want you to use your left hand for some of these simple tasks, like drinking from a cup, using a computer mouse, brushing your teeth, opening doors. So that exerts exerts their self-control to change their behavior. The first study actually that worked, when we tried this, we told people just work on your posture for 2 weeks. Whenever you think of it, stand up straight, sit up straight. And then we brought people to the laboratory and we tested them on things that had nothing to do with posture or left hand, right hand, and yet their self-control had improved there. The best results done by some people in Australia who worked on, got people to work on things that they were really concerned about. So in one of the studies, they got people who were having trouble saving money and got them to make a financial plan. They met with them for about 4 months, maybe once a month, to review their progress. And sure enough, the people got better at saving money. That's not too surprising. What is surprising is that when they came back at the end of this and laboratory tests that had nothing to do with saving money, they did better. I mean, the test, I remember, it was like the shell game. You looked at the computer screen and there were 6 squares. They started moving all around and you were supposed to remember 3 of them and keep track of them. And meanwhile, there's another TV right here playing a comedy video. It's very funny. So you're tempted to look over there, but if you look over there, you'll miss what's happening on the screen and lose track of which of the squares you're supposed to be following. So again, people were better at that task. It has nothing to do with saving money, but having exerted the discipline to save money for a couple months, they were then better at that task. And they also reported various other improvements in their lives. They're less likely to leave the dishes in the sink overnight, and their study habits got better. They even ate better, which goes against the money, because healthy food is more expensive than junk food. And yet, they showed better self-control even in their eating as a result of trying to save money. So, yes, people can indeed improve their self-control. Like a muscle, it gets stronger with exercise. Well, some people say, well, I have good willpower for doing my homework and not good self-control for keeping my hair clean or keeping my room clean or whatever. That's not really technically correct. As far as I can tell, there's one resource that people use for all these different things. All our studies, measure self-control in one sphere, or manipulate on one sphere, and then measure on something completely different. It means that same basic resource carries over for all the different things. So maybe you have better self-control for work than for personal hygiene or vice versa, but you could just employ it the other way. What makes people say that, I think, is that since it's limited, people allocate it more to one thing than another. For some people, doing well at work is more important. For some people, keeping a clean apartment is more important. So you allocate this limited resource for different things, but it's the same resource. The main domains which have been studied with self-control is controlling your thoughts, as in everything from trying to discipline your thinking to shutting that annoying song out of your mind, making yourself concentrate, all those things. Emotional control is a big category, trying not to feel anxious or upset, or calm down your anger, or cheer yourself up, or get yourself out of being too happy. Any sort of change in emotion. Impulse control is the most familiar one, I think. It's restraining your urges to eat foods that aren't healthy for you, smoke cigarettes, drink, take drugs, have sex with the wrong person, behave aggressively, all sorts of things like that. And last, task performance is also a challenge for self-control. Making yourself persevere in the face of failure, making yourself keep at it, trading off speed and accuracy. Do I want to try to get a lot out there, or do I want to make it slow down and get it right the first time? Making yourself not choke under pressure, perform up to your capacity. All these things reflect self-control. So they all draw on the same resource as one stock of willpower. And it also means, though, that if you spend it on one sort of thing, you have less available for other sorts of challenges. Now, I've talked mainly so far about self-control, and that's where we started. That was the research I was looking at on self-regulation, and we pulled it together and concluded, yes, there is this energy that seems to be devoted for self-control. If this resource were just used for self-control, that would already make it a big, important part of the personality, a big, vital part of the self, because self-control is so important to success in life, and as you've seen, something we use every day many times, and something. So already that would mean that this is very important. But it turned out that same willpower resource, that same energy resource, is used for some other things too. One important one is decision-making, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but also initiative, being active instead of passive. that self-control uses that. I'll just mention the initiative very briefly, as I want to spend more time. I think people are interested in decision fatigue and how decision making goes into it. The initiative, we got this too, might use the same sort of energy for one of the studies, for example, we did was first we depleted people's self-control or not, and then we let them into a room with a little computer, and so the next part is just going to be administered by the computer. Follow the prompts, which will tell you what to do, and use the keyboard to respond. The experimenter hits start on the computer and leaves the room, and the computer just goes to blue screen, and it stays there, and nothing happens. And so our measure was how long did the person just sit there staring at this at the screen before getting up and saying, "This is not working, something's happening." And sure enough, the people who had used up some of their willpower in the first task just sat there twice as long, not doing anything, just staring at a blank screen. To take the initiative to get up and say, something's wrong here, let's take action, I don't want to spend all night in your experiment room. That takes willpower too. If they had expended their willpower in the first part of the experiment, then they were slower to summon it up in the second part. All right, now let's talk about decision making. After making decisions, we found that self-control is impaired. These were the first studies. We did things like have people, we got a whole bunch of consumer products and had people look at them. And in the control condition, they just looked at the products and rated if they used them and stuff like that. But in the decision condition, people looked at these items in pairs and said, well, which one would you rather have? A red t-shirt or a blue t-shirt? Blue t-shirt or a green t-shirt? Vanilla scented candle or an almond scented candle? And on, and made a lot of choices like that. So in both conditions, they all looked at the same products, all thought about them and so on, and spent about the same amount of time. But then when we gave them one of the classic lab tests of self-control is how long can you hold your hand in ice water before it gets too uncomfortable and you pull it out. And that's clearly a mind over matter kind of thing. It's unpleasant and painful, and you have the impulse to pull it out right away, but you have to override that and hold it. And again, the people who had made the choices, they pulled their hand out much faster. So making all those decisions took something out of them, used up some willpower. So they didn't have that available to enable them to keep trying and keep persisting and keep holding their hand in that cold water. Not all decisions are equally depleting. The more decisions you make, the more depleted you are. Now, some people objected to this and said, well, the choices in your study weren't necessarily fun. Oh, they were choosing what products they'd like to have. But I said, well, when you're making a decision that really resonates with the self and choosing something that you enjoy, that should not deplete you. Well, that was a plausible argument. Indeed, they had an experiment or two that suggested that, but they had people only make one or two choices. So we said, well, is that really going to be true generally? There's no penalty as long as you enjoy making decisions. It won't deplete you. So we set up an experiment to test that. We got people to like the task or to dislike it. Usually you have to make different tasks, and that's a problem. But we hit on something that people just had very different reactions to, which is a bridal registry game. When you register to get married. Actually, one of our postdocs had brought this because she'd gotten married, and she said, oh, we did the bridal registry, and I spent a couple of hours at this store going all of these decisions like, what color gravy boat and what design of my spoon. And, oh, by the end, I was so wasted, you could have talked me into anything. So we said, all right, we'll just bring in undergraduate students as participants and say, okay, pretend this is going to be, you're getting ready for your wedding, and here's some products, and just make some choices as to what you would like. And some of them loved this. This is so cool. I love thinking about my wedding and planning. And others thought, I hate this. Who wants to think about getting married? That gives me the creeps. And so we could use the same condition. We'd have people in different circumstances, whether they liked it or hated it. And then we had some go for 3 or 4 minutes, and others go for 12 minutes. Well, at 3 or 4 minutes, it mattered a lot whether they liked it or not. The ones who didn't like it were depleted. The ones who liked it, after 3 minutes, were not depleted. They didn't show any drop in their self-control performance, or at least it was not significant. So yes, enjoyment of the decision matters. At 12 minutes, however, everybody was depleted. It didn't matter whether they liked it or not. At 12 minutes, it got to them. So I think, yes, enjoyment does play a role, but it's not a freebie. It still takes its toll. And as you continue to make decisions, eventually it gets worn down, and your energy is depleted, and your performance will suffer. Some decisions deplete more than others. A nice paper a couple of guys at Yale did about a year and a half ago suggested that it's how much you're giving up. That what depletes you most is kind of seeing what the option you didn't have, all the features that made that attractive. That's what's hard, is to relinquish and say, well, if I'm going to get the fuel-efficient car, I can't have the one with the good safety record or the plush interior design or whatever. The more features, the more things you're giving up, the more depleting it is. And also there's some evidence that when there's a clear right answer to a decision, then that's not all that depleting. One thing's clearly better than others. But when the decision is difficult and they're about equally, maybe price and quality go up at the same level, well then, that's hard to figure out exactly how to do it, and that depletes people a lot more. What enables people to recover from making decisions? Well, rest and glucose I'm going to get to in a little bit. There are some ways to at least temporarily overcome decision fatigue. I want to mention here some stuff that just came out on the web and I added today. You may have noticed how dapper our president's been looking in his gray suits. Well, it turns out he wears only gray suits, or only blue suits. He had this interview in Michael Lewis in Vanity Fair. He says, "You'll see I wear only gray or blue suits." He said, "I'm trying to pare down decisions. I don't want to make decisions about what I'm eating or wearing because I have too many other decisions to make." So essentially the idea is making decisions depletes your limited willpower. And he's right, it fits our research. Co-author was hoping he could get a picture of Obama holding our book, but I'm sure it was somebody on our staff read something on his staff. Anyway, what he's saying is absolutely right. You can't expend a lot of your energy making decisions. It's one reason I think, it's one reason I think that people often have the same routine in the morning. They eat the same things, do the same things, and so on. You don't want to make a lot of decisions and use up your willpower over breakfast. You want to save it for the important challenges of the day. And the link to self-control was helpfully elaborated by a recent blogger who says Obama wears boring suits so he won't tweet pictures of his penis. I suppose some of the political scandals where people do ridiculous things, you wonder how they did it. It is at least plausible from our research that when they deplete their willpower in making these decisions all day, then you wonder, how could they not have enough sense to know about these things? But they seem like a good idea at the time, and your capacity to resist your impulses is somewhat compromised. I'm not here to make excuses for misbehaving politicians, but it is something to watch out for if you get into that situation yourself. Making a lot of decisions will leave you vulnerable to self-control failure. All right, let me turn briefly to what are some of the effects. What are some of the effects of choosing while you're depleted? I've talked about making decisions affect self-control. How does self-control depletion, or the depletion from decision-making, how does that affect other decisions? Here's some of the things that have been identified so far. First, people become more interested to avoid or postpone decisions. They would rather just not choose. I go to the decision-making conferences, they study decision-making the way you'd imagine. They say, well, here are two descriptions of cell phones or watches or computers or TV sets. Well, which one would you choose? But in real life, people have often the option of not buying any of them. Saying, skip it, I don't want either of these. Well, it turns out when people's self-control is depleted, they're more likely to say, I can't decide, I don't want to choose, I'll leave it till later. Postponing decisions was popular. Compromise. People in full possession of their willpower and self-control powers, they are natural compromisers. They'll trade things off, they will look for a middle ground. It's something we as humans, again, do much more than other animals. It's not like the bear and the fish say, well, let's compromise, you can have the tail. But humans compromise extensively. However, when they're depleted, compromise tends to go out the window. Willpower has been used up in self-control, and then people will pick the extreme. So even price and quality trade-offs. Most people think, well, I want to get some quality, but I don't want to spend the maximum amount of money. So they'll look for a medium level of price and quality, look for the best deal for the money. But when they're depleted, they just pick one dimension and maximize it. They either give me the cheapest or give me the best, but they sort of disregard one dimension. It's a simpler way of making decisions. The default option, that comes to dominate. If there's you can decide not to decide, or you can keep sort of standard weight, then people who are depleted go with that. There's a nice study done with the Audi dealers, car dealers, where they, many decisions to make when you buy a fancy car, and so they put the two conditions where they put all these decisions in one order or in the opposite order, and saw how much did people just pick the standard, the default option, as opposed to picking it exactly where they are. And sure enough, as whichever the order was, as people went along, they were more and more likely to pick the standard option. It appears Audi dealers had somewhat already figured this out, because their usual shtick was to start by having you use up all your willpower deciding which of the 238 interior fabric choices you want. And you expend all your energy doing that. And then later in the process come all the things where the standard option is very expensive, rust proofing and whatnot. And so people, by that point, they're depleted, they don't realize it, and they say, I'll just take whatever standard, and you can spend a lot more money that way. Other decision changes, impulse, self-indulgent, people more likely to give in to things, the kinds of decisions people make. There's a study where the students were going to the library, and they asked them either going to the library to study or coming home to study. They gave them a choice between which sort of movie would you like to have a coupon to watch. And there were some highbrow intellectual movies. This was done by Yale, and the students there presumably fancy themselves intellectual, and so there was a lot of preference for the highbrow artsy sorts of movies. And sure enough, but they were also offered sort of sleazy, lowbrow movies, exploding cars, naked women, that sort of thing. So what do you find? Well, when they're going to the library, they've still got their willpower intact. They wanted to see, I think come Sunday, I want to see an intellectual movie, and they picked those. After several hours, they're coming home out of the library. Then they wanted the exploding cars and naked women kind of thing, the lowbrow choice. The same with choice between a chocolate bar and a granola bar, things like that. As people get depleted, they choose more lower indulgent kinds of impulses to guide their decisions. Last but not least, some evidence that people let their decisions be based on irrational things that logically should be irrelevant. And some complicated experiments, which I won't go into unless people are really interested. But decision makers have shown that people sometimes make a decision based on the facts and sometimes get swayed by stuff that logically shouldn't play any role in it. And that increases when people get depleted. They're not seemingly able to say that this is irrelevant, let me focus on what are the important things that matter, and so the decision is degraded. All right, a couple more things in terms of intellectual performance. People don't think as well. To put this in context, psychology has found two variables that really predict success in life across a broad range of spheres, a broad set of endeavors. These are intelligence and self-control. So they're both quite important in life, and when I talk to my colleagues who study intelligence, I tell about self-control and say, well, is it really just intelligence? But it turns out I think it's the other way around. What looks like intelligence is really self-control. So when people's willpower is depleted, their IQ scores go down. They're not as smart. And we've done this with just giving people a standard IQ test after they tried not to laugh at a funny movie or in some other way used up their willpower. And they get worse. Now, not all mental operations get worse. We had some where we compared rote memory, can you memorize this list of words and bring it back and so forth. The other, where you have to engage in logical reasoning. It's the reasoning, the controlled processes that suffers. You can learn stuff, you can memorize stuff, you can compare it back from memory. It's not like your vocabulary gets worse when your willpower is depleted, but your ability to manage where you move by systematic rules from one thought to another thought, another conclusion, that gets worse. Likewise, extrapolation. Tasks like if we give you the population of St. Louis and ask you to estimate the population of Kansas City, people get less accurate at doing that sort of thing when they're depleted. So again, that effortful when the conscious self has to manage the transition from one thought to another, that's what gets worse with depletion. But a lot of the automatic processes, information in and out, people can do that just fine. Still, the higher order mental processes get worse when you're depleted, and intellectual performance suffers. How much time do we have? I'm supposed to quit at 9, or at 8, is that right? And we're there? 8 o'clock, okay. Well then, let me move right on to the end here. I'll skip the glucose. It's just a fuel in the bloodstream, and that work is still going on. Very interesting processes there. In terms of what depletion feels like, that's the last thing I want to talk about. How do you know when you're depleted? What does it feel like? The pictorial representation from the London Times. This was their idea. She is holding an apple, I want to point out. It's not the first thing you usually notice in that photograph, but she's going in. Anyway, it turns out there isn't any clear feeling. Even the meta-analysis I mentioned, the combined results from lots and lots of laboratory studies, said there's essentially no clear evidence of what it feels like. Maybe there's a tiny increase across many things of a negative emotion, but that could just be that some procedures emphasized it more than others. Maybe people say they're a little tired or fatigued more than others, but even that's not very reliable and usually doesn't show up. So there's no particular signature feeling to let you know you're depleted. What our more recent studies suggest is that instead of any particular feeling, it seems to make all manner of feelings become more intense. So both positive and negative ones, whatever you happen to be feeling, if your willpower is depleted, you feel it more strongly. It sort of turns up the volume on life. That seems to be the best sign. We have done a number of studies to test this, and people think the sharks are scarier, the puppies are cuter, the nice figures are more attractive, the ugly ones less attractive. The cold water, if they put their hand in cold water, feels colder. All sorts of subjective evaluative feelings are stronger among people whose willpower is depleted. So part of what willpower does is sort of help damp down the impact of life as we go along. So, to conclude, self-control capacity depends on willpower, on this limited energy we have. It's an important part of the psyche, an important part of the self. It is limited. We have a limited supply of it. It may not be as limited as we think. I mean, the body has multiple stores of this and so on. But clearly it operates as if it's limited, and if people begin to conserve it when even just a little bit is down. It's relevant to self-control, but it also contributes to intelligent thought, to decision-making, to initiative, probably also to planning and a few other really important functions. Taken together, I think these, given the importance of those phenomena in human life, it does have a claim to be regarded as certainly one of the greatest human strengths, because self-control and rational choice and planning and initiative and intelligent thought, these are very much what we're about as human beings. These are what enabled us to construct these wonderful cultures that have improved our survival and reproduction way better than any other mammal, and that make these wonderful, comfortable lives for us, and then ultimately enable us to be human. Thank you very much.
If you have a question for Professor Baumeister, say, come out to the outside aisles.
You probably have a speaker up here. Say something one more time.
Testing? No, it's not.
Okay, how about if I take this one over here? Okay. If anybody has any questions, you'd like to step up? Desiree, you may want to step back a bit.
Someone has a question? Hey.
Thank you very much. I've read your book, and in the book you say in the morning you're the freshest, your brain is the freshest, so you can make better decisions. And in my job, a lot of times they have meetings like at 5 o'clock or late, and I was thinking like the unions have been negotiating, late in the evening, how do they make good decisions? And what do you do, like today, what did you do today so that you're fresh to give this, great talk?
Okay, there are a couple things. when you're staying up till 9 o'clock at night in a meeting, they're often not really expecting to get the best decisions made. Often it's to try to get any decision made. And so maybe there wearing them down is useful. Perhaps they think that if they have better stamina than the other side, they will have an advantage. But certainly, you're completely right. If you want to make a good decision, at the end of a hard day is not the best time. Now there is at least short-term fixes. I didn't get to talk about glucose because wasn't quite enough time. But when people get a dose, glucose is a chemical in the bloodstream that carries energy. It's brain fuel, among other things. So there's some findings that when people get a dose of that, and it comes from any food that you eat, it's not just sugar, then that will at least temporarily restore you. Now remember that the Germans in that study, it was a downward spiral across the day, even though they were presumably eating from time to time. But at least it helps. In the book we talk about that study with the judges, the parole judges in Israel, and they, across the whole, when a parole judge decides these prisoners have been in prison for a certain amount of time, they have an application to be let out, say, I've paid my debt, I've reformed, can I go back to society? The easy thing for the judge to do is just say no and send them back, because if they get out and commit another crime, it looks bad for the judge. So the simple option is just send them back. That's almost the default. But some of them really have reformed and then deserve to do that. What the study found, created a bit of a scandal in the legal community, was that the likelihood of being paroled just went down as the day wore on. So from the first, if you came up first thing in the morning when the judge was fresh, you had a pretty good chance of getting parole. As the day wore on, your chances got worse and worse, with a couple exceptions. Right at, I think, 10:30 or whatever, there was a break in the Israeli judges, and they got a sandwich and a piece of fruit, and then suddenly they went up again. They were more likely to grant parole, and then down and down again until lunchtime. I think if you were the last one before lunch, these are two guys in a row, the last one before lunch or the first one after, it was something like a 12 or 15% chance of getting parole if you were the last one before lunch. Very dim odds. If you were the next one, first one after lunch, it was like 70%. So what happens at lunch, you get a lot of fuel into your body, and the body processes it and puts the glucose back into the bloodstream. It'd be too simple to say glucose is willpower, but clearly that contributes to it. And in practical terms, for your question of what can you do to make yourself fresh to perform or make good decisions late in the day, at least for a short period of time, get something to eat. In the laboratory, we do these studies where we give people a glass of lemonade that's sweetened either with sugar or with Splenda. They taste about the same. People like them the same and so on. But sugar is the only one that gives you glucose. And so sugar will wipe out a lot of these depletion effects, that suddenly their self-control is good again. Splenda doesn't do it, though the effect remains the same, even though they enjoy the beverage the same amount. Obviously, I'm mindful of the irony of consuming sugar as the means to have better self-control, but that's just in the laboratory. We look. Sugar works, gives you a quick up and then a quick crash, so it's really not ideal. People will have a candy bar or something to get ready for a difficult decision or something like that. But it's better to have protein or something that you burn over a longer period of time. If there's a targeted, that in 20 minutes you've got to really make your case. Just a limited amount of time. Well, then maybe. Sugar would work. In general, though, eating food would help do that. As for what I do, I don't know. I served a very nice dinner before this time. Thank you.
Hi. Over here.
Okay.
Yeah. I see all kinds of applications for this research. I think it's really awesome. But I wanted to ask about two in particular. So, do you see any implications? The first question is in relation to ADHD, number one, and number two, like treating ADHD or measuring it or something. And number two, what kind of implications do you see in helping create both student and employee success?
All right. Let's start with the ADHD. That's not my area, and I don't work with special populations of it, but I know there's some very excellent treatments of ADHD as specifically a self-control deficit. So yes, that's highly relevant. Now, why it is, there's a lot of controversy about that. Are we just not raising kids with the same amount of discipline? Is the sugar that we give them as kids, is this somehow producing weird effects? Sugar is not that good for kids. Some people think it's television or whatever. But for whatever reason, the behaviors exhibited by people with ADHD are consistent with what happens with poor self-control, poor impulse control, restless and aggressive and running around, unable to stay focused and stay concentrating on one thing. So yes, very obviously ADHD. This is a central part of it. Okay, that was the first one. Now the other question was helping students and.
I was thinking in terms of organizational behavior. What can we do to help students and employees have success in relationship to willpower and self-control? How can understanding willpower and self-control as an educator or as an employer help you have your students or your employees have better success?
Okay, one reason we wrote the book, we wanted to help people use these things. For one thing, just understanding how it works, that there's a limited supply, know how to husband it and to use it judiciously. There's work-family interactions, which people have talked about for a long time, but not really known what's the mechanism. But if you're having a lot of conflict with your romantic partner at home, that's sucking the life out of you. It's using up your willpower to that, and then you get to the office and you won't perform as well because you don't have it. It also works the other way around. As a marriage counselor I quoted in the book who said, you'd always told patients in marital therapy to go home early. He says it's kind of ironic because if you're having a bad marriage, the last thing you want to do is rush home to see your sweetie. But he said, the mistake is to use up all your willpower at the office. You hadn't really understood the mechanism until you heard our work, and that's why, is that they basically stay at the office, deplete themselves there, and then they go home, and it's hard to make themselves be nice, and the first annoying thing the other person says, they blow up. And that. So one application is the work-family balance, importance of eating right and sleeping enough as a parent, getting food throughout the day, not making major decisions late in the day. Understand that cumulative effect from the Beeper study shows just as the day wears on, you get worn down and your decisions won't be as good and your self-control won't be as good. Understanding the interaction between self-control. Also, another thing I didn't get into, which actually have changed my own work. I remember when I would be sick or even just sort of be fighting sick, the physician would sometimes say, oh, don't work, you should just go to bed and rest and recover. I thought, oh, what the heck, in my work I'm not out digging ditches or carrying heavy loads or anything. I'm just sitting at my desk at my computer. That couldn't possibly be bad for me. So I make myself continue to work and try to write a few more pages when I was fighting off the cold. Well, it turns out the immune system is a huge user of glucose, of this fuel, but it's very uneven over time. So when you're healthy and nothing's wrong, then it doesn't really take very much glucose. But when you're fighting a cold, then it sucks off a lot of the glucose to use for that, and the more the better. So that's why you shouldn't go and make yourself work when you're not feeling well. And sure enough, I would make myself sit there and write these pages, and then I'd go back and read them when I got better. And this is really bad. Why did I bother? I should have just gone to bed. And so what I do now, starting to get sick, is if I can, I just cancel everything, crawl into bed, and just try to sleep for 36 hours, and let your body use all its energy to fight the disease, and then you don't get sick. And I'm talking to some of the students today about how to maximize your productivity in life, and you look for efficiency. It's more efficient, even though it feels like, oh, I should just stay up and get that done today. It's more efficient in the long run to not get sick, to sleep for 36 hours. You just get up every so often and drink a cup of tea or whatever, and sleep as much as you can. Let your body use all its energy for that, and then go back to work rather than fight yourself, make it keep going, and then you get cold anyway, and then it drags on for 3 weeks, and you're miserable, and you're infecting other people, and your total amount of productivity is impaired that way. So those are some of the things I think that people can do to put this to work for them.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello. Is there any evidence that willpower changes as we age? We teach little children willpower, or self-control perhaps is a better term, but I feel like I've been doing willpower and self-control my whole life, and I don't feel a whole lot better at it.
There is a variety of evidence. I mean, you nicely didn't mention how old I am. I'm beginning to suspect myself that there's a downside to getting old. Research is indicating that old people do suffer from a variety of deficits of self-control. Now, it's ironic, old people are actually happier than young people, but that may be a change in priorities and a change in what they focus on. Fortunately, the impulses that need to be controlled also seem to get weaker. So it's not like you turn into an axe murderer at 60 or whatever because your self-control's gone. The murderous rages behind it are probably long gone as well. What tends to happen is the signs are old people will say the wrong thing or blurt out something that they shouldn't have done, and that's been shown in experiments. So, I mean, yes, one's powers of restraining oneself and making yourself conform to those do seem to weaken in old age. We don't have a ton of research on that. We've tried to do some experiments using our stuff, but there are complications in using old people. With a control condition, they thought they were supposed to memorize everything, and so they were working twice as hard as the others. So you have to explain things a lot more thoroughly so that they know exactly what it's about, and then by that point it's not really comparable to the young person condition. Still, the evidence, the best we have, does suggest, yes, there's some decline in the power to manage yourself as you get older.
I was wondering if you have any advice for parents of children to help them develop self-control beyond, obviously, just not giving them a cookie every time they ask for one. And of my children, I think it comes much easier to some of them than others. Is there evidence that some people, this just comes easier to them based on their personality?
The second question, self-control is an important part of personality. Some people are better at it than others. We don't know yet what's the mixture of genes versus environment. Experiences do make a difference. I wouldn't bet against there being some genetic impulse or some genetic contribution. Part of that could be impulses. Some people have stronger impulses than others. By all accounts, boys are much wilder than girls, so even if the self-control capacity were exactly the same, the boys would have more trouble conforming to rules and stuff. And discipline in schools, they pick way disproportionately on boys much more than girls, but the boys are behaving worse because they're much stronger impulses. Now, in terms of advice for parents, the first thing is forget about self-esteem and concentrate on self-control. Just making this your priority already does a surprising amount of good, because you know what to watch for. I think, unfortunately, parents got the self-esteem message and say, well, I want my kids to have high self-esteem, so to translate that, I should never criticize the child, never set rules, never challenge them for something where they might fail, always tell them they're doing a great job at everything. And it's not even a good way to build self-esteem, but it's particularly bad for self-control. It undermines this. Instead, use self-esteem as a reward when the child earns it by showing good self-control. If you make that your priority and realize that's what you want your child to have, then you can watch for behaviors that do it and be quick to punish lapses in self-control. So don't let the kid act out or have tantrums or anything like that. Immediately stop that from happening. You can start the self-control exercises quite early. Our daughter was breastfed for several years, and as a child, she would, very small, she would cry when she got hungry. That's what babies do, and so baby can't really control. But when I was an older baby, my wife started saying, "Well, now stop crying, control your emotions," and so it took all her energy. So physically, she suck up her deep breaths, and then she would stop crying, and then immediately give her the breast to reward her for that. She developed this tremendous emotion control. Everybody said, "What a very well-behaved child." She's trying not to be an actress. Emotion control is good for that too. In terms of punishment, you do need to punish misbehavior, and if you're going to instill self-control, do it. There are 3 elements of punishment. 2 of them are important, and 1 is counterproductive. There's how consistently do you punish, How severely do you punish, and how rapidly do you punish? What you should be sure to try to do is be very consistent and very immediate. When you punish the kid today for something you did yesterday, a small child won't even remember or know what that's all about. And consistency, you can't let it go sometimes and punish other times. But severity of punishment is often counterproductive. Punishing the kid very severely will generate negative reactions and undermine their trust in you and their sense that the whole system is fair. But many parents particularly do, and parents have a lot of challenges these days too, busy lives and dual careers and all that, is they'll, when they're tired on occasion, they'll let it go and the kid misbehaves, but then when it gets too bad, they'll try to make up for it by punishing really severely. But think of the child, what it learns from that. It learns that punishment is random, that sometimes I can get away with it, and sometimes there's a really severe punishment for essentially the same behavior, that it learns that the system is unfair and there's no sense following the rules. You've got to discipline yourself as a parent, punish it every time is the first thing, and then as soon as that happens, then the child will learn very fast, and if it's consistent, that enables that to be internalized. I see these parents at the mall where they bring the kid in, and the kid's, well, I want to go to the toy store. And they say, no, you can't go to the toy store. Wait, I want to go to the toy store. And the kid then grabs onto the door and starts screaming aloud, and won't let go and say, okay, we'll go to the toy store. Well, what are you training the kid to do there is to lose control, make a scene, and what kind of adult is that child going to grow up into? I'm struck by some of the things in that Confessions of a Tiger Mom book, the Asian mothers who really emphasize self-control and how they bring up their kids. So we never just give the kid what it wants. You say, well, okay, if you want this, you can have it on Tuesday if you're good over the weekend, or if you make your bed or something like that. Instills the idea of learning, of working toward a goal, instills the delayed gratification. Now, you absolutely need to follow through. Because if you say you can have it on Tuesday and then you don't deliver it on Tuesday, even if the kid was good, then the kid learns not to take those deals. But if you always make sure that happens, and another thing to do is even just to praise the kid. I remember my wife saying to our daughter when she was little, I know you didn't get what you wanted, but you didn't make a tantrum. That was really good of you. I know you were upset about that, but you held it together, and that was really commendable. So you're really praising a non-behavior there. But it was a very important non-behavior, because lots of kids will just act out and scream and cry when they don't get what they want. But if your goal is to instill self-control, watch for when the kid shows it and reward it. You need both reward and punishment for maximum learning. There's always this debate about, can you do it with just one or the other, which is more important. There's no question, though, maximum information for maximizing learning is to punish what's bad and reward what's good. So really be on the lookout for the positive as well as the negative.
Thank you for the lecture. My question is, if there have been any studies, or if you could speculate about the connection between having a well thought out code of conduct or an ethic, maybe even linguistically represented or written down, and the ability to accrue or work the muscle, more rapidly, like you said, knowing what you're going to have for breakfast or knowing what kind of suits you're going to wear is a good way to get those decisions out of the way. But what about having even stronger ethical decisions already planned out?
Well, anytime you can plan things out, as I said, you pre-commit is the term, whatever, it produces better results. Using willpower to bail yourself out of a crisis, then should be the last resort. And people are overconfident in their willpower. You see recovering alcoholics, and some of them say, I just can't be around alcohol at all. And the others say, no, I've kicked the habit, I can go in the bar with my friends and sit there and I'll just have a Coke. And, well, guess who relapses? There's even lab studies they did with smokers where they said, we want you to watch this movie it's about smoking. It makes smoking look very nice. Now, you can choose which deal you want. If you can do it with your cigarettes in another room, if you can watch the whole movie without getting up and getting a cigarette, we'll give you $5, I think. If you can watch it with the cigarette on the table in front of you, we'll give you $8. If you can do it with a unlit cigarette holding in your hand for the whole movie, that would be $12. And if you can hold an unlit cigarette in your mouth without lighting up for the whole movie, we'll give you $20. So people would make their choice, but the ones who picked the $20, they'd watch this and they didn't light up and they would lose their bet. So they were overconfident in the amount of willpower. Setting things up in advance, as we said, with good self-control, avoiding temptation, avoiding problem desires, that seems to work much better. Now, we have morality because people are in difficult situations. You can't really just decide to be good for the rest of your life and arrange for that to happen. People have temptations and impulses and problems, so we do need it sometime. But learning the code, and the more you behave morally, the more it improves your ability to do it on other occasions.
Yes, you alluded briefly to the role of religion. I wonder if you could explicate some of the research that deals with the role of religious belief and or behavior regarding willpower.
Okay, yes, there was a major review of the literature out about 2 or 3 years ago that religious people have better self-control. So religion is one contributor. And I say this, I'm not religious, but I do have a lot of respect for religion, the positive contributions it makes to society. The work, the guy who wrote it is somebody I know. He said he got started, the first project he noticed that religious people live longer, and he combined all the published studies that showed that religious people have longer lives than other people. And well, religious people probably think it's because God is helping them survive or something like that. But that's not really a scientific explanation. So he wondered, what was it? And began to think that, well, religion promotes self-control, which does clearly contribute to longevity. So now, how religion does this is not as clear. There are a bunch of theories, and they all could be true. They're not mutually exclusive. One is that a religious person partly has higher standards, so you're not supposed to drink or smoke or do various bad things, depending on which religion you are. You espouse, certainly not commit crimes. Or, you're also part of a community if you regularly attend church. And other religious people watch out for each other and sort of notice if someone's starting to show problem behaviors. There's somebody more likely to come around and try to correct your behavior. Apart from other people, religious people think God is watching them all the time. And again, scientists would take any position as to whether God is really watching or not, or whether that makes a difference. But certainly the belief that a divine being is watching you and judging you means you can't get away with misbehavior. So that too could contribute to good behavior. You also mentioned the idea of the willpower and these exercises. Lots of religious practices require discipline just to comply with them. Meditation is an obvious one, where especially more strenuous meditations where you have to sit motionless in a particular position and discipline your mind to focus on something. That could be training in self-control. But even the less severe ones, like praying every day, that you have to get yourself together and discipline yourself to do it. Certainly attending church regularly, you have to be there at a certain place and time, and you'll be dressed up and all those things. So there are a lot of activities by virtue of being part of a religion that could contribute to better self-control. In brief then, we do know that religion is one thing that supports self-control. Religious people tend to have better self-control than others. We're not sure why. Possibly multiple pathways contribute to that.
We have time for one more question.
I'm just wondering how stress and willpower would be related. For instance, when you're in a high-stress situation, is your willpower depleted right away, or are you not able to access it and use it as well?
This is a great question. In fact, coming to the end of a multi-year grant on exactly this topic, stress and self-control. And we don't have the definitive answer yet. There are a variety of interrelationships. We know that people with good self-control report that their lives are less stressful. We know that if we make people see their lives as more stressful without changing the actual amount of stress, just you can manipulate how they perceive their lives. Perceiving it as more stressful makes them perform worse at self-control tests. And that probably has to do with, see, coping with stress takes willpower, takes that energy. So if you're thinking, oh my God, my life is such a mess, I got to deal with all these things, then you're not going to put out that same amount of energy to work hard on the laboratory task that we give them, because you're more thinking, I better save it for the more important stuff. Again, we get these results just from manipulating their perception of it without actually administering any real stress. My guess is, again, coping with real stress should take your willpower. In fact, I wonder sometimes if burnout is just sort of a chronic depletion effect. That people talk about burnout as you're trying to produce these good ends. You're working in a field where you have high ideals, but you're frustrated by the bureaucracy or the clientele or the circumstances. You feel like you're beating your head against the wall, and essentially you use up all your energy, and over time it feels like you can't get anywhere. Now, whether there is a chronic depletion that's not a temporary state that you recover from after a good night's sleep, I don't know, but burnout might also affect your sleep and impair your ability to recover there. So putting this all together, there are probably back and forth that self-control reduces stress. The best way to reduce the stress in your life is to stop screwing up. If you have self-control and you can stop getting yourself more problems, that already will make a huge difference. So people with good self-control are better at that. So that's self-control affecting stress. It almost certainly goes the other way too. Perceived stress, and not presume real stress, but likewise drain your resources and thereby impair your self-control. So it's probably a reciprocal bidirectional relationship. But we need to learn much more about that. All right, well, thank you again very much.
Thank you for coming to the Elmhurst College event this evening. Your presentation, Willpower, Discovering the Greatest Human Strength, was both interesting and informative. I'm sure many of us will take the lessons that we learned today and carry them out throughout our personal and our professional lives. I would like to present a gift to you on the behalf of Elmhurst College. Thanks, yeah. My name is Jennifer Gianetto. I'll be graduating this May, class of 2013. I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening and joining us. And I encourage you to attend our upcoming events that will be listed up here. The first one is on Tuesday, October 2nd. It will be at noon. We have an Illinois State President, John Fullerton, visiting us. My impression is he's a senator. And on the 3rd of October, which is a Wednesday, at 4 p.m., we have the Cesar Chavez Guestship, From Cloning to Cell Therapy, A Life in Science. We have a special lecture presented by Bishop Gene Robinson on October 4th at 7, Justice and Compassion in an Age of Demonization. We also have Dr. William Johnson Guestship on October 9th at 4 p.m., presented by Simon LeVay on the science of sexual orientation. And last but not least, our Niebuhr Forum on Religion in Public Life on October 11th at 7 p.m. on Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Clerics. Dr. Baumeister's book is available for purchase at the back of the room this evening. He's also graciously agreed to do some book signings. If you've purchased the book already, you can also bring that one up there. Let's all use our self-control and Form A line in the center aisle. And if you have any more questions or information, you can visit the website www.elmhurst.edu. Thanks again for joining us tonight. And have a